Hi, it's Bruce Williams at the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce. We've had a lot of talk lately about what's going on around the whole idea of COVID and what we're going to be dealing with as we continue on through the next few months. I would like us also to begin by recognizing that I live and work on the traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish nations, in particular the Lekwungen-speaking nations of the Songhees and the Esquimalt. So the words that have been popping up in our conversations lately, words like COVID, pivot, you're on mute, pandemic, all of those words. My guest today is a very distinguished physician. Dr. Srinivas Murthy is the co-chair of the World Health Organization's Clinical Research Committee on COVID-19. He is also an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine at University of British Columbia and a critical care and infectious diseases physician at the BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
You're operating at a pretty high level here, representing this country on the world stage, aren't you?
I think there's a lot of people working on various stages right now. I think the signs of coordination and collaboration are crucial. And I think there's many Canadians who are trying their best to keep the world on the right trajectory moving forward.
Yeah, we talk about the frontline workers, the important role they play. The researchers are just as important because people like you that are working on trying to find out what a vaccine will look like for this. So if I can just get a really simple elementary school education here briefly, what exactly is a vaccine and how does it work?
Sure. So a vaccine is something that effectively protects you from getting a disease. And we like to think in infectious diseases is that an infectious disease vaccine is something that prevents you from getting or suffering severe effects of a infectious disease. And there's various ways that we can get that protection. A lot of times it's through our immune system. And so we basically allow our immune system to be exposed to the infectious disease without really being exposed to the dangerous part of the infectious disease. And then our immune system gets used to that infectious disease and then gets protection from it. And that's how all of our vaccines typically work. We get our flu shots every year. We get our vaccines when we're babies. When we're older, we get our shingles shot and so on. And this upcoming COVID vaccine will likely work in a similar fashion.
So a vaccine is not a cure, though.
A vaccine is not a cure. So once you get the disease, other groups are working on treatments for the disease. And so that's a separate piece of science that's also ongoing and a very active scientific work right now.
So how is it developed? Like, what's the beginning point? What sort of science has to go into creating, identifying the disease, first of all, and then developing the vaccine?
Sure. So if you were to say move back to January, the most important thing that happened was that the virus sequence was released to the world. Namely, the Chinese scientists who first identified that there was something happening sequenced the virus and shared that piece of information with the world. And then the scientists around the world could basically start their race at that point with knowing what that virus sequence was and what the shape of its proteins were. And that process has been underway for the past 8 months now, and obviously it's accelerating right now.
There's some risk involved in this, I'm pretty sure, right? If you're going to be, for example, testing a vaccine, you have to go to someone who has already been infected, or sorry, has not been infected.
Correct. And so the way a vaccine test works is that you take a large group of people who have been uninfected and give them this trial vaccine, and then see what happens over the coming weeks and months and compare groups who did not get the vaccine to groups who did get the vaccine and see if there's a lower rate of infection in the vaccinated group. It's important that we do it in a place where there's circulating virus. And so right now, most of the trials are being done in places like the United Kingdom, in Brazil, the United States, places with very high or previously high levels of community transmission.
How do you find those people? Do they volunteer? Are they sought after by researchers, or
both? Both. And so there's a lot of volunteering, and I think we all should salute all of those volunteers all around the world who are sort of in the name of science, in the name of accelerating our knowledge gain, are willing to volunteer for these research studies. That being said, these research studies are being done by very experienced and highly qualified science under the auspices of research ethics boards. And so while we say we should thank them for volunteering themselves, their safety is being monitored very, very rigorously.
Yeah, and the people doing that work are scientists, they're doctors, they're both. What are they?
Both scientists, doctors, clinical researchers, all of those people are doing those things.
Just take a stab at this. How many people do you think around the world are looking at trying to find a vaccine right now? How many actively involved in that?
So there are hundreds of vaccine candidates right now at various stages of approval right now. Some of them are just in a lab working on trying to figure out if it works or not in a lab. And a few of them are in phase 3 testing, which is the very last phase before we say whether it's safe and effective. And those few are the ones that we're all paying very close attention to see what those results will be.
Where is Canada on the world stage in this? You're proud to say you're a Canadian, and we're proud of the work that you are doing, and so many others too. But in the world mix of all this stuff, where is Canada? Are we leading?
So Canada, from a scientific perspective, has a number of candidates that are working their way through the process, and the government of Canada has just invested in one of those candidates. It's at a relatively earlier phase compared to the phase 3 ones that you probably have heard about in the news more so. And those are the ones coming from big companies out of Europe, China, and the United States. And so while Canada's vaccine candidates aren't pushing the phase 3 envelope yet, they are in the mix of things. And Canada is supporting, as a government, those other companies and those other agencies to do these other clinical trials in a collaborative and coordinated way.
How many times a day are you asked, when's the vaccine going to be ready?
Not just a few.
Okay, so I'll ask you, when's it going to be ready? Do you have any idea? What's your best guess?
Unclear. And so I think there's a couple of things to think about when we say when a vaccine will be ready. There's the first report from the first trial that says that this vaccine is safe and effective. And so that could happen later on this year, conceivably, with the number of trials that are happening. That's very different than having a vaccine jabbed into your shoulder, because the process at which a vaccine is declared effective, then all of the regulators around the world have to decide and look at that data and say, is this good enough for our population? And each country will have their own standards as to say what is good enough in terms of safety and in terms of effectiveness to declare something to be approved in that country. And then once it's approved, it has to go through a huge dissemination process. And this is a scale of logistics that no one really has done yet in sort of history on this sort of time scale. We want to vaccinate everybody in a very short period of time. And so the logistics required for that, from needles and syringes and people who can vaccinate and getting the vaccine to all of these places. Remember, the current candidates are primarily cold chain requiring, meaning they have to be kept at a very cold temperature all the way until they're vaccinated into the people. And so that requires a separate logistics step that adds complexity to the whole operation. So while we may have results later on this year, it may take a bit longer. I'm not going to give you an exact timeline, just a bit longer than that before vaccines are widely available.
So the pandemic, I'm going to call it a roadmap, a guide that was put in place, which was taken off the shelf and implemented when this all started. Would that plan include that distribution model that you're talking about? Like, how are they going to spread it around so that it's on the ground and available at the same time for everybody?
Yeah, now people have thought about this, and this has been obviously a huge point of conversation over these past number of decades as we've sort of thought about deployment of pandemic vaccines. Obviously, there's going to be an order to things. Namely, some people will be vaccinated before others. And that's been decided, and there's various ethics groups and public policy groups who look at both from a population, how can we most vastly protect people, and also from an ethical perspective, who deserves it before others. And so I think most groups have settled on healthcare workers, for example, given their exposure to the patients with disease as being of primary importance in vaccinating first. After that, different groups have come up with different sort of objectives as to how the vaccine gets deployed.
Did this all surprise you when this came along? I mean, you've spent your life studying exactly what you do now, but were you surprised when this came along?
I wasn't surprised that there is a pandemic in the year 2020. I am like, obviously this virus has surprised many people along the way and how it acts, and it continues to surprise, and we're continuing to learn things every day about what works on this virus and how this virus functions in our world. But the fact that there is a pandemic this year is not surprising. I think this is the natural cycle of these things. Every period, every few years, there will be something like this. Remember in 2009, there was a pandemic flu that killed hundreds of thousands around the world. Obviously, it wasn't on this scale, and this is more of a once in a century type event.
What would you say to people who say that they don't have to wear a mask?
I say that if we want to get through this, and get through this meaning get back to a life where we can have close interactions without risking straining our hospitals, without risking our vulnerable, then protecting ourselves and more so protecting the people around you are of so fundamental importance. While you yourself may not have a huge amount of risk of getting severe disease, and I think that's a concept that people are working on sometimes, it doesn't mean A, you can't transmit it to someone who is more vulnerable than you, and B, we're also learning quite a bit about this virus. And just because you don't have a severe acute event doesn't mean that there's not long-term effects that may or may not affect you. And so both in protecting yourself and in protecting your community around you, it's absolutely fundamental that we use all of the tools at our disposal, and that includes masks.
Doctor, thank you for your time and the important work that you're doing. We very much appreciate that. And we may reconnect again, maybe when we're a little closer to getting through all of this. Dr. Srinivas Murthy is the co-chair of the World Health Organization's Critical Research Committee on COVID-19. He's an associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine at UBC and a critical care and infectious diseases physician at BC Children's Hospital. Doctor, thank you again.
Have a good day. Thank you so much.